Taking this desperate caregiving job was supposed to save me after my divorce. Instead, on my first night, I found my own divorce papers hidden inside a secret wall cavity in the patient's room. Then the man everyone called insane looked at me, perfectly lucid. "They didn't hire you to save me," he whispered. "They hired you because you are the perfect scapegoat." My sudden downfall was never an accident. My name is Aurora Bennett. I am 36 years old, and until exactly 8 months ago, I believed my life was a fortress. I lived in Briar Cove, Rhode Island, a coastal town where the ocean wind bites through your coat from November to April. For a long time, the cold never bothered me. I had a solid career as a senior reimbursement claims reviewer at Harborline Review Services. I had a warm home. I had a husband I trusted implicitly. Then, the fortress crumbled. Grant Mercer did not leave our marriage with shattered glass, screaming matches, or tearful confessions in the middle of the night. His departure was a masterpiece of clinical precision. He packed his designer luggage on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at the office. When I came home, he was standing in the hallway, wearing his expensive wool coat. "This is not working anymore," Grant said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "I have made arrangements." He had indeed made arrangements. Grant took the bulk of our liquid savings, transferring them to accounts I could not access because he had carefully restructured our finances over the preceding 12 months. He took the mutual clients we had entertained in our living room. He took the entire social network we had built over 7 years of marriage. He walked out the door, and the silence he left behind was heavier than any argument could have been. But the divorce was only the first blow. The true devastation came 3 weeks later at Harborline. I was called into the Human Resources office and presented with an internal audit file. Someone had flagged a series of vague financial discrepancies in the accounts I managed. There was no hard proof of embezzlement, no police involvement, but the implication was a heavy, suffocating cloud. The management offered me a choice: resign quietly or face a prolonged public investigation. I chose to resign, believing I could easily find another position with my pristine track record. I was incredibly naive. The corporate world in Briar Cove was small and deeply interconnected. Whenever I applied for a new position, the background checks returned with mysterious red flags. I was blacklisted. My professional reputation was incinerated, leaving me completely unhireable in the only industry I knew. The descent was rapid and merciless. I had to vacate the comfortable house Grant and I had leased. I packed my remaining life into cardboard boxes and moved to a deteriorating apartment on the east side of town. The building smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and damp drywall. The heating system was a joke, leaving me to sleep in my winter coat on the worst nights. I began the humiliating ritual of selling my possessions to survive. My grandmother's silver tea set went to a pawn shop for a fraction of its worth just to cover the minimum payment on my credit card. I sold my designer work bags, my winter boots, and eventually my wedding ring, pouring the meager funds into the gaping maw of my divorce lawyer's retainer and the predatory loan I had taken out just to replace the transmission on my 10-year-old sedan. Every single day was a battle I was losing. My mornings consisted of staring at my laptop screen, watching the automated rejection emails pile up in my inbox. "We have decided to move forward with other candidates." The words burned themselves into my retinas. My afternoons were punctuated by the aggressive ringing of my phone. Debt collectors do not care about your broken heart or your ruined career. They only care about the numbers. "Ms. Bennett, we are calling regarding your past due balance." The voices would drone, metallic and devoid of empathy. "Can we process a payment over the phone today?" "Not today," I would answer, my throat tight with a mixture of rage and panic. "I am between jobs. I need more time." "Time is not a currency we accept, Ms. Bennett." To escape the ringing phone, I would sometimes make the mistake of opening social media. That was where Grant lived his new reality. There was no mourning period for him. While I was counting pennies to buy generic brand pasta, Grant was posting photos from charity galas and luxury yachts. He wore custom suits and held glasses of expensive champagne, surrounded by people whose net worth required commas and zeros I could not fathom. The pain in my chest was not jealousy. It was a terrifying realization. Grant had not just moved on, he had ascended. He had stepped directly into an elite world of extreme wealth and power within mere weeks of handing me the divorce papers. It was as if invisible doors had swung wide open for him, doors he could not possibly have unlocked on his own. Sitting in the freezing dark of my living room, watching my breath turn to mist in the cold air, I started to suspect that my ruin had been engineered. The financial discrepancies at work, the drained accounts, the sudden, meteoric rise of my ex-husband. It felt too synchronized to be bad luck. I suspected there were hidden layers to my divorce, dark currents moving beneath the surface that I could not yet see. But suspicion does not pay the electric bill. I did not have the luxury of playing detective. I had exactly $42 left in my checking account. The Rhode Island winter was closing in fast, promising blizzards and sub-zero temperatures. The most pressing issue was not solving the mystery of Grant Mercer. The most pressing issue was simple survival. It happened on a Thursday night. The wind was howling against my thin window panes, rattling the glass in its frame. I was wrapped in a blanket, endlessly scrolling through a specialized job board on my laptop. I had expanded my search far beyond financial review, looking at anything that offered a paycheck. Retail, janitorial work, data entry. Nothing was biting. Then, my eyes caught a listing that stood out from the dreary gray text of the other advertisements. It was not posted by a company, but by a private agency representing a high net worth family. The title read, "Live-in Behavioral Caregiver Required. Immediate start." I clicked on the link. The description was sparse but intense. The position required residing at a private, isolated estate. Absolute discretion and a signed non-disclosure agreement were mandatory. The duties involved the direct care and supervision of a male patient suffering from severe mental instability and unpredictable behavioral outbursts. No formal medical degree was required, but the applicant needed exceptional resilience, an unshakable demeanor, and the ability to follow strict protocols without asking unnecessary questions. It sounded demanding. It sounded isolating. Frankly, it sounded dangerous. Caring for an unstable man in a remote location with a strict gag order was the kind of scenario that triggered every survival instinct I had left. But then I saw the compensation package. The salary offered for a single month was more than I had made in 6 months at Harborline. It included full room and board. If I took this job, the eviction notices would stop. The debt collectors would be silenced. I could dig myself out of the suffocating hole Grant had pushed me into and have enough breathing room to figure out my next move. I stared at the glowing letters on the screen. The money was a lifeline thrown into raging waters. I could not afford to question who was holding the other end of the rope. My pride was gone, stripped away by the cold and the hunger and the endless rejections. I smoothed down my hair, took a deep breath, and typed out a cover letter highlighting my ability to handle high-stress situations and manage complex routines. I hit send at exactly midnight. Less than 15 minutes later, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was an unfamiliar number. "Hello?" I answered, my voice raspy from disuse. "Aurora Bennett," a woman's voice said. It was crisp, authoritative, and entirely devoid of warmth. "We received your application for the caregiving position. Are you available for an immediate interview tonight?" I looked around my pathetic, freezing living room. I looked at the stack of unpaid bills sitting on the counter. "Yes," I said, gripping the phone tightly. "I am available right now." I knew the job had the scent of risk all over it. The late-night call, the exorbitant pay, the demand for absolute secrecy. It was a gamble. But when you have already lost everything, playing a dangerous hand is the only option left. I closed my laptop, put on my only clean blazer, and prepared to step into the unknown. The salary would save me from bankruptcy for several months. That was the only truth that mattered tonight. 2 days later, a sleek black town car carried me away from the decaying streets of my neighborhood and deep into the isolated coastline. Blackthorn House was located nearly an hour's drive from the center of Briar Cove. Situated on a jagged peninsula where the ocean relentlessly pounded against the cliffs. The property was entirely severed from the surrounding civilian life by a dense, suffocating wall of dead, skeletal trees, and a towering wrought iron gate painted pitch black. When the heavy gates groaned open and the driver navigated the winding gravel path, the mansion finally revealed itself. It was a sprawling, imposing structure of dark stone and slate, magnificent but entirely devoid of warmth. It looked less like a home and more like a beautifully constructed mausoleum. Waiting for me in the grand foyer was Lenora Vale. She was the stepdaughter of the man I had been hired to keep alive, though she looked more like an executive ready for a hostile takeover. Lenora wore a perfectly tailored, cream-colored suit that stood in stark contrast to the dreary light filtering through the high windows. Every strand of her dark hair was sprayed rigidly into place. Her posture was flawless, her smile practiced and utterly devoid of any genuine emotion. She was elegant, restrained, and so suspiciously proper that my instincts immediately signaled a warning. "Ms. Bennett," Lenora said, her voice echoing slightly against the marble floors. "Welcome to Blackthorn House. I trust your journey was acceptable." "It was fine, thank you," I replied, maintaining a professional neutrality. Lenora gestured for me to follow her down a long, dimly lit corridor, adorned with oil paintings of stormy seascapes. As we walked, her high heels clicked sharply against the stone, setting a militant rhythm. "Let us be entirely clear about the situation," Lenora began, not bothering to look back at me. "The man you are here to care for is my stepfather, Jonah Vale. He is 68 years old and the founder of Vale Meridian Logistics. I assume you did your reading." I nodded. Even though she could not see me, Vale Meridian Logistics was a private shipping empire, a titan of industry. The man who built it from the ground up had to be ruthless. A year ago, Jonah suffered a mild stroke, followed by a severe fall that resulted in significant head trauma. Lenora continued, her tone clinical, as if reading from a legal briefing. Since then, his cognitive decline has been steep. He suffers from acute paranoia, violent panic attacks, and extreme behavioral outbursts. He is, for all intents and purposes, entirely disconnected from reality. Your job is to ensure he does not harm himself and that his daily routines are strictly managed. She stopped in front of a heavy oak door and finally turned to face me. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. "To manage his condition, we have established protocols," she said. "These are not suggestions. Ms. Bennett, they are absolute. First, you are never to use your personal cellular phone on the first floor of this house. Second, the West Wing office is strictly off-limits to everyone, including you. Third, you will not ask questions regarding the former caregivers or any previous staff members who are no longer employed here. Finally, all of Jonah's medications are secured in a designated lockbox in his quarters. You will only dispense what is explicitly handed to you by the head nurse during the shift change." The rules felt less like medical guidelines and more like the terms of a prison sentence. They were bizarrely specific, engineered to keep me blind, deaf, and isolated. But I thought about the crushing debt waiting for me back in Briar Cove, and I swallowed my unease. "I understand the protocols completely," I said. Lenora offered a tight, bloodless smile. "Good. Let me introduce you to the core staff before you meet the patient." We entered a massive, spotless industrial kitchen where two people stood waiting. The first was an elderly woman in a neat gray uniform. Lenora introduced her as Marta Quinn, the head housekeeper who had been with the estate for decades. Marta wiped her hands on her apron and offered a small, trembling smile. Her eyes darted toward Lenora, then back to me. She opened her mouth slightly, and for a fleeting second, she looked utterly desperate to tell me something. But the moment evaporated under Lenora's chilling presence, and Marta snapped her mouth shut, retreating into silence. Standing by the back exit was a man who looked entirely out of place in a kitchen. He was heavily muscled, wearing a tactical dark suit with an earpiece securely coiled behind his neck. "This is Eli Sloan," Our head of security, Lenora stated. Eli did not smile. He simply crossed his arms and looked me up and down. His gaze was heavy, invasive, and deeply cynical. He analyzed my posture, my cheap coat, and the exhaustion clinging to my face. He looked at me the way a gambler looks at a losing racehorse, silently calculating exactly how many days I would last before I broke. "Follow me," Lenora commanded, turning sharply on her heel. "It is time you met Jonah." We ascended a grand sweeping staircase and walked down another long hallway until we reached the east wing. Lenora pushed open a set of heavy double doors, leading us into a stunning glass-enclosed sunroom that overlooked the churning gray ocean. Sitting in a reinforced armchair facing the glass was Jonah Vale. He looked frail, wrapped in a thick wool blanket despite the controlled heating of the room. His white hair was tangled and overgrown, framing a face lined with deep, exhausted crevices. One of his hands rested on the armrest, trembling with a slight, continuous tremor. He looked exactly like a broken, hollowed-out old man waiting for the end. But as our footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor, Jonah turned his head. For 3 brief seconds, our eyes locked. In that minuscule fraction of time, I saw an intelligence so sharp and piercing it nearly made me gasp. The fog of dementia, the vacant stare of the broken patient, it was entirely absent. Behind those tired eyes was a mind calculating, assessing, and fiercely alive. It was a predator's gaze, locked inside a failing cage. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the sharpness vanished. Jonah's eyes widened in sudden, manufactured terror. He lunged forward, his trembling hand swatting violently at the small table beside him. A heavy crystal water glass shattered explosively against the floor, sending jagged shards and icy water flying across the polished wood. "Get out!" Jonah roared, his voice a gravelly, thunderous explosion that shook the glass walls. "Who is she? Who sent her? Get her out of my house!" He began to thrash in his chair, kicking at the blankets, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated madness. It was a terrifying spectacle, perfectly aligning with every rumor of his mental collapse. I instinctively took a step back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I glanced at Lenora, expecting her to intervene, to call for medical assistance, or at least to show a shred of concern for the man she called family. Lenora did absolutely nothing. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped elegantly in front of her. She was not looking at her thrashing stepfather. She was looking squarely at me. Her dark eyes tracked my flinch, my breathing, the way my hands curled into fists at my sides. She was studying me under a microscope. This entire introduction was not a test of Jonah's stability. It was an audition to see how I handled the chaos. "That is quite enough for today," Lenora said smoothly, her voice cutting through Jonah's screaming without raising an octave. "We will try again tomorrow when he is sedated." She turned to leave, expecting me to follow immediately. I took one last look at the shattered glass on the floor and began to back out of the room. Just before I crossed the threshold, Jonah stopped thrashing. The screaming ceased as if a switch had been flipped. While Lenora was facing the hallway, Jonah turned his head slightly over his shoulder. He threw a single, fleeting glance in my direction. It was short, freezing, and terrifyingly lucid. It was a look that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken warnings, a silent transmission tearing through the staged madness. It told me that the shattered glass, the screaming, the insanity, it was all a performance. And as I followed Lenora down the dark, silent hallway, the suffocating realization settled into my bones. The real danger in Blackthorn House was not the insane man I was hired to protect. The real danger was the terrifyingly sane people who had trapped him here. Sleep was an absolute impossibility. The coastal wind slammed against the reinforced glass of my bedroom window, a relentless, howling barrage that sounded like something trying to break in. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the suffocating atmosphere inside my quarters. Every shadow cast by the heavy mahogany furniture felt deliberate. Every stretch of silence felt engineered. I lay rigid on the unfamiliar, overly firm mattress, staring at the ceiling as the antique clock down the hall chimed 11 times. The sheer proximity to the man next door kept my nerves frayed. My bedroom shared a connecting door with his suite, locked from his side but inherently vulnerable. I kept waiting for the screaming to start again. It happened exactly midnight. A sound so minute I almost convinced myself it was just the massive house settling against the wind. A faint, sharp metallic scrape. It did not come from the hallway. It did not come from the adjoining door. It came from directly behind the solid oak headboard of my bed. I threw off the heavy duvet and crept out of bed, the polished floorboards freezing against my bare feet. I pressed my ear against the intricate wood paneling of the wall. There it was again, a distinct click, followed by the soft hum of displaced air. I ran my fingertips over the carved grooves of the wainscoting, searching blindly in the dim moonlight filtering through the storm. About 2 feet above the floorboards, my nail caught on a seam that felt unnaturally smooth. It was not a decorative line, it was a structural gap. I pressed my palms flat against the adjacent panel and pushed sideways. The wood resisted for an agonizing second before sliding open with a soft, well-oiled whisper. It revealed a narrow, pitch-black cavity. I reached for the small emergency flashlight I kept in my travel bag and clicked it on. The thin beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a space that was entirely unexpected. It was not a dusty crawl space filled with asbestos and forgotten pipes. It was a narrow, meticulously maintained service corridor, a hidden artery running between the walls of the estate. More chillingly, directly behind my headboard was a built-in observation alcove. A small wooden stool sat in front of a narrow brass grate that looked directly into the adjacent suite, right at Jonah Vale's bed. Someone had been using this space to watch him in the dark, but the viewing grate was not what made my blood run cold. Stacked neatly on a built-in wooden shelf to my left were several thick manila folders. I pulled the top 3 down, my hands trembling violently in the freezing air of the corridor. The first folder contained old medical charts, dense with pharmaceutical jargon and psychiatric evaluations. The second folder was thicker, containing heavily redacted incident reports involving previous caregivers, terminated without cause, breached confidentiality, unstable behavior. The reasons for their sudden departures were varied, but the pattern was undeniable. None of them had lasted more than 3 weeks. Then, I illuminated the third folder. The breath left my lungs in a violent, silent rush. Printed in bold, black letters across the tab was my own name. I opened it, my hands shaking so badly the thick papers rattled against each other. This was not a standard employment background check. This was a complete, invasive autopsy of my ruined life. The first page was a pristine copy of my divorce decree, highlighting the exact lack of spousal support. The second page was a comprehensive credit report, circling my overwhelming debt in bright red ink. I flipped the page and felt a sickening wave of nausea wash over me. There were printed copies of my internal disciplinary file from the firm back in Briar Cove. How had they obtained that? It was strictly confidential, locked behind corporate firewalls. Further down was a printed copy of an email I had sent exactly 9 days ago, applying for a desperate, entry-level accounting job at a tiny boutique firm. I had used a private, encrypted server on my personal laptop. Yet here it was, along with the subsequent rejection letter. They knew I was drowning. They knew exactly how much water I had swallowed. They had tracked my desperation down to the very minute. I was not hired because I was qualified. I was hired because I was completely, utterly isolated. Tucked into the back pocket of the folder was a small, ragged piece of notebook paper. The handwriting was sharp, erratic, and deeply indented, as if written in a frantic hurry by a previous occupant of this room. I shined the light directly onto the words. If you find this place, check the night medication. Do not drink anything they bring up. You found it faster than the others. The voice came from the dark. It was low, steady, and entirely devoid of the manic screaming I had witnessed hours earlier. I spun around, dropping the file onto the wooden floor. Jonah Vale stood in the doorway of the hidden passage, where it connected to his own room. He wore a dark silk robe. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his face. The frantic, terrified old man with the vacant stare was completely gone. His posture was straight. His jaw was set like carved granite. His eyes were cold, calculating, and terrifyingly sharp. He looked at me with the absolute, crushing authority of a man who had built shipping empires and destroyed global rivals. "They chose you because you are desperate," Jonah whispered, stepping 1 foot forward into the narrow alcove. The air between us crackled with a dangerous electric tension. "A person like you is easier to turn into a culprit than a witness." I stood paralyzed, my mind struggling violently to bridge the gap between the raving lunatic thrashing in the sunroom and the commanding presence standing before me. "You are not sick," I breathed, the words barely audible over the roaring wind outside. "Do not react," Jonah commanded, his voice slicing through my shock with surgical precision. "Do not ask questions you are not prepared to hear the answers to. If you panic now, they will know. You must close this panel, go back to your bed, and act exactly like the broken, exhausted woman they meticulously hunted down." He took a step closer, his piercing eyes boring into mine, anchoring me to the floor. "If Lenora suspects for a single second that I'm coherent, or that you have seen these files, neither of us will leave this house. They did not hire you to manage my care, Aurora. They hired you to take the fall when I finally die." Before I could form a single word in response, Jonah retreated into the heavy shadows of his suite. The hidden door clicked shut behind him with quiet, absolute finality. I was left completely alone in the freezing, hidden corridor, clutching the metal flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. The storm raged against the stone walls of Blackthorn House, but the true terror was locked inside with me. I carefully gathered the spilled papers, ensuring they were perfectly aligned. I returned the files to the exact spot on the shelf, stepped back into my bedroom, and slid the heavy wooden panel shut. I climbed back into the cold bed, staring up at the pitch-black ceiling as the wind howled outside. The fear of caring for a violent, insane patient had vanished entirely. It was replaced by a horror infinitely more profound. I had not found a lifeline to save me from my ruined marriage. I had walked straight into a meticulously designed slaughterhouse, and I was the bait. The morning light was harsh, offering no comfort as it spilled across the stone floors. I forced my hands to remain steady as I carried the breakfast tray upstairs at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. Inside the suite, Jonah Vale was already awake, sitting near the window. He did not look at me with the piercing clarity of the previous night. Instead, his shoulders slumped, his jaw hung slack, and he mumbled incoherently about shipping routes from 30 years ago. When I offered him the bowl of oatmeal, he knocked the spoon away with a clumsy, weak swipe, splattering it across his lap. "I do not want it," Jonah whined, his voice thin and petulant. I glanced toward the open doorway. Eli Sloan was standing there, his arms crossed, watching my reaction. I swallowed my pride, grabbed a linen napkin, and began to clean up the mess with the quiet, defeated compliance of a woman who desperately needed her paycheck. Jonah kept up the act flawlessly, and I played my part right alongside him. No one in the house could possibly suspect that less than 8 hours ago, we had stood in a hidden corridor discussing my impending doom. By 10 in the morning, the house settled into a suffocating quiet. I was downstairs in the grand foyer, organizing a stack of medical delivery receipts on a side table, when the heavy sound of tires crushing gravel echoed through the front doors. I glanced through the narrow side windows. A sleek, black luxury sedan rolled to a stop at the base of the stone steps. The driver quickly exited and opened the rear door. The man who stepped out wore a tailored charcoal overcoat that fit him perfectly. His posture was casually arrogant, his movements smooth and practiced. I would recognize the slope of those shoulders and the sharp profile anywhere on earth. It was Grant Mercer, my ex-husband. All the air instantly evaporated from my lungs. My hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard my joints screamed. I stepped back into the shadow of the staircase, my mind reeling in violent disbelief. What was he doing here? This was a remote fortress on the edge of the Atlantic, miles away from the corporate high-rises of the city. The heavy oak doors swung open. Lenora Vale stepped into the foyer, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. She extended a hand, offering Grant a smile that was uncharacteristically warm. "Grant," Lenora said, her tone indicating deep familiarity. "Thank you for coming all this way." "It is my pleasure, Lenora," Grant replied. His voice was the same rich, persuasive baritone that had once promised to love me for the rest of my life. Lenora turned, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows until they locked onto me. "Ms. Bennett?" she called out, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Come here, please." Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to run out the back door, to flee into the freezing woods, but I had no car, no money, and nowhere to go. I forced my legs to move, stepping into the harsh morning light of the foyer. Grant turned around. Our eyes met. I expected shock. I expected a stumble in his polished demeanor. Instead, his expression barely shifted. He allowed his eyebrows to rise exactly 1/fraction of an inch, painting a flawless portrait of mild, polite astonishment. It was the face of a man running into a distant acquaintance at a coffee shop, not a man confronting the ex-wife he had financially decimated mere months ago. "Aurora," Grant said smoothly. "Goodness, what an entirely unexpected place to run into you." "You know each other?" Lenora asked, though the cool, calculating glimmer in her eye told me she already knew the answer perfectly well. "We were married," Grant answered, his tone light, almost conversational. "A lifetime ago. It seems we finalized the paperwork several months back. I had no idea you had moved into the caregiving sector." "Aurora. It is certainly a pivot from financial review." He was mocking me right in front of her. "Ms. Bennett joined us recently," Lenora said, brushing past the revelation as if it were a minor triviality. "Grant is a senior risk consultant with the asset restructuring firm managing my family's portfolio. He is here to assist us in evaluating the legal and financial vulnerabilities of the estate. Specifically, he will be advising on the competency profile we are building for Jonah. Should his condition require us to assume full conservatorship..." The words hit me like physical blows. Grant was not just a guest. He was the architect of Jonah's legal demise. He was here to help Lenora build the cage, lock the door, and throw away the key. "I will be conducting interviews with the staff and reviewing the daily logs," Grant added, his eyes locked onto mine with a cold, predatory gleam. "I look forward to reading your reports. Aurora." Lenora excused herself to take a phone call from her legal team, leaving Grant and me entirely alone in the long, dimly lit corridor outside the West Wing study. The second Lenora disappeared around the corner, the polite veneer melted off Grant's face, leaving behind something utterly hollow and terrifying. He took 2 steps toward me, closing the distance until I could smell his expensive cologne. "You look tired, Aurora," he said softly, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a razor blade against my skin. This sort of work must be exhausting for someone so thoroughly accustomed to a desk. "What are you doing here, Grant?" I demanded, keeping my voice equally low. I refused to let him see me tremble. He smiled, a slow, patronizing curving of his lips. "I am doing my job. I advise high-net-worth clients on mitigating catastrophic risks. And currently, a violently unstable man controlling a massive logistics empire is a very large risk." "You planned this," I said, the horrific realization settling heavily into my chest. "You did not just leave me. You destroyed my career on purpose." Grant tilted his head, feigning innocent concern. "You destroyed your own career, Aurora. Those audits were quite damning. It is a tragedy you had to sell your grandmother's silver just to make the minimum payment on your credit card. I believe your deficit was hovering around $25,000, was it not? The legal fees alone must have been crushing." My breath hitched. He knew the exact numbers. Those were details I had discussed with absolutely no one. They were buried in the file I had found hidden behind my bedroom wall the night before. "You gave them my file," I whispered, the blood rushing in my ears. "You should focus on doing a good job here," Grant said, Ignoring my accusation entirely, his tone was light, almost friendly, which made the underlying threat infinitely worse. The Vale family pays very well. You need the money. It would be a profound mistake to ask questions that do not concern you, or to cause any unnecessary trouble. Your past is not nearly clean enough to survive another scandal. If you fail here, there is no safety net left to catch you. He reached out and adjusted the collar of my uniform, a gesture so intimately violating I had to fight the urge to strike his hand away. Just keep your head down. Feed the old man his pills, and collect your paycheck, Grant murmured. Do that, and perhaps you will survive the winter. He turned and walked toward the study, leaving me standing frozen in the silent corridor. My mind violently pieced the jagged fragments together. Grant had not simply abandoned our marriage to chase a wealthier lifestyle. He had been embedded in Lenora Vale's financial network long before he ever packed his bags. The missing savings, the sabotage of my professional reputation, the swiftness of his ascent into elite circles. He had orchestrated my entire downfall to render me completely destitute, completely isolated, and completely desperate. They needed a caregiver for Jonah who had no friends to call, no family to visit, and no credibility left to be believed by the police. Grant had looked at the woman he had promised to love and decided she was the perfect raw material for a corporate conspiracy. He had built the trap, baited it with an exorbitant salary, and waited for me to walk right into it. I leaned against the cold stone wall, fighting a wave of profound nausea. The man who had methodically dismantled my life was standing just a few feet away, laughing softly as he answered a call on his phone. He had ruined me once, and now I was trapped in an isolated mansion, watching him prepare to ruin another human being. But as the shock slowly receded, leaving behind a cold, hardened core of absolute fury, I realized Grant had made one fatal miscalculation. He believed my desperation made me weak. He did not understand that a woman who has already lost everything is the most dangerous person in the room. I survived the catastrophic encounter with Grant by retreating into the only armor I had left, my professional training. For 7 years at Harborline, my entire career was built on dissecting fabricated narratives. I hunted discrepancies in medical billing. I knew how to read the negative space of a bloated insurance claim. Grant and Lenora thought they had hired a broken, terrified woman. They forgot they had brought a senior auditor into their crime scene. I stopped reacting to the terrifying atmosphere of the estate and started observing it clinically. Everything became a data point. I memorized the exact shape and color of the medication labels. I tracked the handover signatures in the daily logs, noting the pressure of the pen strokes and the specific times of delivery. I watched the hallway cameras, calculating their blind spots and rotational sweeps. I memorized the scheduled arrivals and departures of the private physicians. The first massive crack in the narrative appeared in the daily incident binder. Lenora demanded I read it thoroughly to understand Jonah's violent triggers. As I flipped through the heavy pages in the dim light of my room, my training immediately kicked in. The reports from the previous caregivers were entirely too neat. When human beings describe a chaotic, violent event, their language is inherently messy and inconsistent, but these reports used identical phrasing. Page after page, separated by weeks and written by supposedly different authors, contained the exact same sentence. The patient exhibited sudden hostile ideation, resulting in severe property damage and requiring immediate chemical de-escalation. It was boilerplate text. Someone had drafted a master template for Jonah's insanity and simply instructed the staff to change the dates. The next glaring discrepancy involved the locked medicine cabinet. According to the official charts, Jonah was prescribed a standard regimen of blood thinners and mild beta blockers to manage his post-stroke symptoms. But 3 nights a week, the head nurse left a small plastic cup containing an additional, unmarked blue pill. The chart vaguely labeled it as a supplemental anxiety reducer. I began to chart his behavior directly against the medication schedule. The pattern was undeniable. The violent outbursts, the shattered glass, the terrifying hallucinations, they almost exclusively occurred on the evenings he was forced to swallow the blue pill. On a Tuesday evening, I intentionally fumbled the water pitcher, delaying his dose by exactly 14 minutes while I went downstairs to fetch dry towels. During those 14 minutes, his severe hand tremor was noticeably lighter. His breathing evened out. The absolute moment the pill dissolved in his system, the violent mania returned. The house staff also held jagged pieces of the puzzle. Though they were absolutely terrified to share them, I cornered Marta Quinn in the walk-in pantry one afternoon while she was polishing silver with a manic, nervous intensity. I stood beside her, pretending to count the inventory of dry goods. "The last caregiver," I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed on my clipboard. "Why did she leave so quickly?" Marta froze. Her knuckles turned stark white against the dark polishing cloth. She looked frantically over my shoulder toward the kitchen door. "She asked too many questions about the night nurse," Marta replied, her voice barely a breath. Lenora called her into the West Wing study. The girl was gone before dawn. All three of them left exactly like that. Poof, vanished in the night. Lenora forced them to sign confidentiality agreements before they walked out the door. If they ever breathed a single word about this house, they would owe the estate $500,000 in penalties. $500,000. It was a financial death sentence explicitly designed to ensure total, unbreakable silence. Even Eli Sloan, the stoic head of security, inadvertently handed me a crucial clue. Late one night, I was fetching a heavy blanket from the linen closet near his monitoring station. The massive bank of screens bathed his face in a harsh, cold blue glow. He was hitting the side of his central monitor in visible frustration. "Is something broken with the system?" I asked casually. Keeping my tone light, Eli scowled, tapping a heavy metal pen against the mahogany desk. "The network feed for the West Wing is dropping data packets again. It is infuriating. The entire system is state-of-the-art, but the cameras outside the master suite lose their signal at completely random intervals." He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "It always seems to happen on the nights the old man is acting his absolute craziest. Just a technical coincidence, I suppose." It was absolutely not a coincidence. Someone was deliberately blinding the security system right before administering the chemical triggers to ensure there was no digital record of the tampering. But the most compelling evidence of all came from Jonah himself. He was not a senseless, vacant shell. He was acutely aware of his environment. He knew exactly what time the heavy deadbolt on the front door engaged every evening. He recognized the distinct, heavy sound of Eli walking down the long corridor. He even knew that Lenora wore a very specific jasmine perfume, and his breathing would accelerate defensively seconds before she even entered the room. A man lost in the terminal fog of dementia does not possess tactical, military-grade situational awareness. On a Thursday afternoon, a violent rainstorm battered the jagged coast, the thunder masking any sound within the suite. Lenora was away in the city attending a legal conference with Grant. I was sitting by the reinforced window, pretending to read a medical journal, while Jonah sat completely still in his armchair. "She changed the lock code on the main gate this morning," Jonah said quietly. His voice was perfectly steady, lacking any of the forced gravel or pitiful tremor. I slowly lowered the journal, my heart pounding against my ribs. "How do you know that?" "Because the security keypad emits a slightly different frequency tone when a new numerical sequence is programmed," he replied, turning his sharp, lucid eyes toward me. "I built a global logistics empire from a single, rusting cargo ship, Aurora. I know exactly how to listen to machines." I pulled my chair closer to him, keeping my voice incredibly low. "I read the logs. I saw the boilerplate reports, and I know the supplemental blue pills are doing this to you." Jonah offered a grim, terrifyingly hollow smile. "You are significantly sharper than the others. That is precisely why Grant recommended you for the position. He arrogantly assumed your intelligence would be completely blinded by your financial desperation." He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on his knees. "I will not lie to you. I am not completely healthy. The stroke took a heavy toll on my brain. I have bad days where the fog rolls in thick, where I genuinely cannot remember the names of my own shipping routes. But I am not incapacitated. I am being poisoned. The synthetic drugs they slip into my nightly regimen artificially induce the violent psychosis. Why? I asked, though I could already see the dark edges of the true motive forming in my mind. Lenora already lives here. She has unrestricted access to the family wealth. This is not about the money sitting in the bank accounts, Jonah explained, his eyes burning with a fierce, suppressed rage. This is about Vale Meridian logistics. In exactly 6 weeks, the corporate board of directors is voting on a massive international merger. It is a hostile acquisition by a foreign conglomerate. I have blocked it successfully for 3 consecutive years. I hold the controlling proxy vote. If I am declared legally incompetent by a medical board before that meeting, my voting rights automatically transfer to my next of kin. He looked toward the locked, heavy oak door, his jaw tightening into rigid lines. Lenora does not just want my house. She wants to sell my entire legacy to the highest bidder for a massive payout. And your former husband is the architect building the precise legal framework to make it happen without triggering an SEC investigation. I sat back against my chair, the sheer, staggering scale of the conspiracy washing over me. Grant and Lenora were orchestrating a corporate coup worth billions of dollars, using a chemical straitjacket to neutralize the only man standing in their way. I was no longer just a desperate woman trying to keep a paycheck to survive the winter. Every observation I recorded, every delayed pill, every hushed conversation in the pantry was pulling me deeper into a terrifyingly high-stakes war. I was meticulously gathering the ammunition to destroy the people who had callously destroyed me. But as the coastal storm raged outside, rattling the glass, I realized a terrifying truth. If they discovered my silent investigation, I would not just lose my job, I would lose my life. I began to test the perimeter of my cage. Using the meticulous auditing skills I had honed over 7 years at the firm, I started to alter my daily routines in ways that seemed accidental but were highly calculated. When the night nurse handed me the small plastic cup containing Jonah's evening pills, I did not just nod and walk away. I held the cup up to the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway, asking pointed questions about the milligram dosage. I asked why the manufacturer imprint on the blue pill was entirely rubbed off. I lingered by the security cameras in the West Wing for exactly 10 seconds longer than my scheduled rounds required, staring directly into the dark glass lenses. The atmosphere in Blackthorn House shifted with terrifying speed. The polite, icy distance that Lenora and the staff had maintained instantly morphed into active, suffocating surveillance. The heavy silence of the estate began to feel like a tightening noose. Eli Sloan started shadowing my movements, his heavy footsteps echoing just one hallway behind me wherever I went. The first retaliatory strike happened on a Tuesday night, at exactly 1:30 in the morning. I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when the piercing, high-pitched shriek of the central fire alarm shattered the silence. The sound was deafening, bouncing off the stone walls and rattling the heavy wooden doors. I threw off the covers, shoved my feet into my shoes, and sprinted down the grand staircase, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I reached the main industrial kitchen to find the entire night staff gathered in a state of chaotic confusion. Marta Quinn was coughing, pointing a trembling finger toward the massive commercial oven. Plumes of thick, acrid black smoke were pouring out of the vents. Eli grabbed a heavy extinguisher from the wall and blasted the interior with white foam. When the smoke finally cleared, the source of the fire was obvious. A stack of dry linen dish towels had been shoved directly against the heating element, and the temperature dial had been cranked to 500 degrees. It was a blatantly staged diversion. A cold spike of adrenaline pierced my stomach. I turned and ran back up the stairs, taking the steps 2 at a time, entirely ignoring Eli shouting my name. I reached the 2nd floor and sprinted down the corridor to my bedroom. I always locked my door from the inside before going to sleep. When I grabbed the heavy brass handle, it turned without any resistance. I pushed the door open and flipped on the overhead light. At first glance, the room looked perfectly normal, but an auditor's eye is trained to notice the millimeter differences in a controlled environment. The heavy duvet on my bed was slightly skewed. The rug was pushed back by a fraction of an inch. I walked directly to the small oak dresser in the corner of the room. The bottom drawer was cracked open. I pulled the drawer out completely. Tucked neatly beneath my folded uniform sweaters was a heavy amber glass bottle. It was completely unlabeled. I unscrewed the child-proof cap and poured the contents into my trembling palm. Dozens of heavy clinical-grade sedatives spilled out. They were the exact type of heavy narcotics used to chemically restrain violent psychiatric patients. They were not listed anywhere in Jonah's official medical handover logs. They had used the fire alarm to clear the floor, infiltrated my room, and planted enough stolen narcotics to frame me for severe medical tampering. The trap sprang shut the very next morning. Lenora summoned me to the grand foyer just after 8 o'clock. Grant was standing right beside her, wearing an immaculate navy suit, his hands casually resting in his pockets. Lenora did not yell. She did not express outrage. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, carrying the smooth, bureaucratic tone of an executioner reading a sentence. "Ms. Bennett," Lenora began, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "It has come to my attention that there have been significant irregularities concerning the inventory of controlled substances in the medical lockbox. Until we can conduct a thorough internal audit of the premises, your key access to the medication cabinet is entirely suspended. You will only provide physical supervision of the patient." I stood completely rigid. I knew if I mentioned the bottle in my room, they would immediately call the police and claim I had confessed to stealing them. I was completely boxed in. Grant stepped forward, invading my personal space. He molded his expression into a flawless mask of polite, patronizing concern. "Aurora," Grant said softly, keeping his voice just low enough so Lenora could pretend she was not listening to every single word. "This is a highly sensitive corporate environment. Given your recent history of profound financial instability and your unfortunate professional missteps back in Briar Cove, an accusation of narcotics theft would be absolutely catastrophic for you. It would mean immediate criminal charges. You do not have the money for a defense attorney." He reached out and gently brushed a piece of lint off my shoulder, a gesture dripping with venomous power. "If you pack your bags and leave voluntarily by 5 o'clock this evening," Grant whispered, his eyes gleaming with cold triumph, "I can personally ensure this little misunderstanding never reaches an official police report. Walk away, Aurora, before you get hurt." I retreated to the west wing, my hands shaking with a mixture of pure terror and boiling rage. I entered the sunroom, where Jonah was sitting quietly by the window. He looked up, his sharp eyes instantly reading the absolute desperation painted across my face. He did not need me to explain what had happened. He knew the enemy's tactics perfectly. He understood they were actively testing my breaking point, trying to crush me into submission or panic me into fleeing. Jonah decided to give them a completely different target. The exact moment Lenora entered the room 10 minutes later to check the morning logs, Jonah erupted. It was not his usual trembling, pathetic paranoia. It was an explosion of raw, calculated violence. He stood up, grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the side table, and hurled it directly at the reinforced glass window. The impact sounded like a gunshot. He screamed at the top of his lungs, a terrifying, guttural roar that brought Eli running down the hall with his hand on his radio. Jonah thrashed violently against Eli, kicking over the medical cart and shouting wildly about poison and demons, forcing Lenora to step back against the wall in genuine alarm. During the struggle, Jonah locked eyes with me for a fraction of a second. The message was clear. He was drawing the crosshairs entirely onto his own back, buying me time to breathe. That night, while the security team was fully occupied managing Jonah's staged crisis, I slipped into the hidden corridor behind my headboard. I needed to clean up the files I had disturbed, terrified that Eli might search the walls next. As I reached deep into the back corner of the dusty wooden shelf to push the folders out of sight, my knuckles brushed against cold, heavy metal. I pulled it out into the beam of my flashlight. It was a bulky, outdated mini cassette recorder. I pressed the play button, holding the tiny, cracked speaker directly to my ear. There was a long hiss of static, followed by Jonah's voice. It was raspy, recorded during his brief, agonizing windows of lucidity. He was verbally documenting the exact times the cameras went dark, building his own desperate ledger against his captors. I fast-forwarded the tape, listening to the agonizing clicks. The static suddenly broke, replaced by the unmistakable acoustics of the West Wing study. Jonah had somehow managed to plant the device and record a private conversation. Two voices were speaking clearly, Lenora and my ex-husband. We cannot use a standard agency nurse for the final phase. Grant's recorded voice echoed thinly in the dark. Narrow space. A professional will notice the chemical shift. We need a buffer. We need someone so thoroughly desperate, so completely drowning in debt and ruined credibility, that if the old man turns up dead with the wrong pills in his system, absolutely no one will believe her over us. I know the perfect candidate. The recording abruptly clicked off, lasting only 15 seconds. It was entirely too short to stand up as concrete evidence in a court of law. A decent defense lawyer would have it thrown out as out-of-context hearsay in 5 minutes, but it was all the confirmation I needed. The chilling reality clamped around my throat, cutting off my air. Grant and Lenora were not just trying to strip Jonah of his legal voting rights. They had pre-written a tragedy. In their meticulously crafted script, Jonah Vale dies of a sudden, tragic overdose. The newly hired, financially ruined, disgraced ex-wife is found with stolen sedatives in her room. She takes the absolute fall for criminal negligence, or worse, manslaughter. Lenora inherits the empire. Grant gets his massive consulting payout, and I rot in a state penitentiary. For the first time since my divorce, the blinders fell completely away. If I made a single misstep, if I played my hand even a fraction of a second too early, I would not just lose this miserable job. I would lose my freedom. I was the final, perfect scapegoat for a billionaire's coup. But as I clutched the heavy metal recorder in the dark, the fear finally burned away, leaving behind a cold, absolute resolve. I was done running. The hidden service corridor behind my bedroom wall became my war room. Over the next 48 hours, while the rest of the house slept under the heavy blanket of the coastal fog, I sat on the cold floorboards with a single flashlight, spreading the contents of my own surveillance file across the dust. I needed to understand the exact architecture of my ruin. I started cross-referencing the documents Grant and Lenora had compiled on me with a crumpled fax transmission I had managed to slip out of the West Wing trash bin earlier that afternoon. The fax was a preliminary legal outline for the transfer of Vale Meridian Logistics. As I traced the lines of corporate ownership, a single entity kept emerging from the dense legal jargon: Marrow Peak Holdings. It was a newly incorporated shell company registered in Delaware, shielded by layers of anonymous proxy directors. According to the fax, this was the exact entity positioned to acquire a massive, controlling stake in Jonah's shipping empire the very moment the medical board declared him legally incompetent to manage his own affairs. Lenora was not just taking over the family business. She was quietly selling a massive portion of it to Marrow Peak Holdings in exchange for absolute, untouchable liquid wealth. But that was not the discovery that made my blood freeze in my veins. I turned my attention back to my own financial autopsy in the manila folder. I looked at the routing numbers and the obscure subsidiary firms associated with the aggressive debt collection agencies that had purchased my ruined credit lines. I looked at the corporate umbrella of the consulting firm Grant had suddenly joined right before he handed me the divorce papers. The parent company of Grant's new firm was Marrow Peak Holdings. The parent company of the agency holding my highest credit deficit was Marrow Peak Holdings. The papers slipped from my trembling fingers. The sheer, terrifying scale of the betrayal slammed into me with the force of a freight train. Grant had not simply fallen out of love and left me to seek a wealthier lifestyle. He had not stumbled into Lenora Vale's lucrative orbit after our divorce. He had been embedded deeply within her financial network for over 14 months. My sudden, catastrophic downfall was not collateral damage. It was the crucial first phase of their corporate strategy. The fabricated accounting errors that destroyed my reputation at Harborline Review Services, the meticulously drained joint bank accounts, the sudden acceleration of my debt. Grant had orchestrated every single detail to ensure I would be entirely destitute right when Lenora needed a completely isolated, vulnerable scapegoat to take the fall for Jonah's impending demise. I was not a victim of a bad marriage. I was a casualty of a corporate acquisition. The next afternoon, the house was eerily quiet. Grant had returned to the city to finalize the medical conservatorship filings, and Lenora was locked in the West Wing study. I brought Jonah his afternoon tea, ensuring the hallway was completely empty before I softly clicked the heavy door shut. Jonah was sitting upright, his eyes clear and sharp. The chemical fog from the previous night had lifted, leaving him tired but profoundly lucid. I sat on the edge of the velvet armchair opposite him and told him exactly what I had discovered about Marrow Peak Holdings and Grant's involvement in my ruined life. Jonah did not look surprised. He simply stared out at the churning gray ocean, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "I built a kingdom from rust and salt water," Jonah said quietly, his voice carrying the heavy, bitter weight of decades. "But I was not a good king. You must understand that. Before you risk your freedom to help me, I was ruthless. I treated my competitors with absolute cruelty, and I treated my family exactly the same way." He turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw genuine, unshielded regret in the sharp lines of his face. "Lenora's mother married me when Lenora was 10 years old," Jonah continued. "I demanded complete control over everything, their finances, their social circles, their futures. I used my wealth as a weapon to keep them entirely dependent on me. When Lenora showed a brilliant aptitude for the logistics business, I dismissed her. I told her the shipping industry was built by ruthless men, and she was simply too emotional to sit at the head of the table. I humiliated her in boardrooms. I actively crushed her ambition for 20 years because I could not tolerate sharing power." His confession shifted the entire landscape of the war I was fighting. Lenora Vale was not a cartoonish, one-dimensional villain greedily plotting in the shadows. She was a woman forged in the freezing furnace of Jonah's own patriarchal arrogance. She truly believed she deserved the shipping empire because she was the only one who had survived his psychological warfare. In her mind, Jonah was not a victim. He was a symbol of a domineering, oppressive generation of men that desperately needed to be eradicated. She was simply using the exact same ruthless tactics he had taught her, tearing down the glass ceiling by burying the man who had built it. "She thinks she is correcting a historical wrong," I whispered, finally understanding the cold, absolute certainty in Lenora's eyes. "She does," Jonah agreed, a grim smile touching his lips. "She believes this hostile takeover is poetic justice, and perhaps, in a vacuum, she is right. But the men she invited into this house to help her build the guillotine do not care about justice." He was talking about Grant. My ex-husband was entirely different from Lenora. Lenora was driven by decades of deep, familial resentment and a twisted desire for validation. Grant was driven by something infinitely colder and vastly more dangerous. He did not have any emotional stakes in the Vale family legacy. He did not care about breaking glass ceilings or rectifying past emotional abuse. Grant possessed a pure, sociopathic ambition. He loved the meticulous mechanics of destruction. He loved the intoxicating thrill of standing at the absolute peak of a mountain built entirely on the shattered lives of other people. He had looked at our marriage, at the vows we took, and calculated my exact market value as a disposable asset. He enjoyed breaking me. He enjoyed watching me sell my grandmother's silver. He enjoyed the polite, mocking conversation in the hallway where he threatened to send me to a state penitentiary. The cruelty was not just a means to an end for Grant. The cruelty was the reward. I looked down at my hands. They were calloused from the grueling physical labor of the past few weeks, the nails clipped short, stripped of any polish. A month ago, I was a terrified, weeping woman begging debt collectors for a few more days to pay a utility bill. I was paralyzed by the shame of my failed marriage and my ruined career. But sitting in the quiet sunroom of Blackthorn House, bathed in the pale winter light, the last remaining shreds of that frightened woman completely dissolved. The profound pain of the divorce evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, diamond-hard clarity. My destroyed marriage and Jonah's manufactured insanity were not isolated tragedies. They were identical links forged in the exact same chain of predatory ambition. We were both just obstacles standing in the way of a massive payout, targeted for removal through forged documents, manipulated chemical restraints, and carefully curated public images. I stood up from the velvet chair. The air in the room felt different now. It was no longer heavy with fear. It was charged with a deadly, quiet electricity. My fight was no longer about clinging to a high-paying job to survive the harsh Rhode Island winter. It was no longer about childish emotional retaliation against a cheating husband. It was about systematically dismantling the massive, corrupt machine that had casually ground my life into dust. They had written a flawless script where I was the tragic, incompetent fool who would take the fall for their brilliant corporate coup. But they had handed the script to a senior financial auditor who knew exactly how to follow the paper trail straight to the architects of the fraud. "They think they have won," I said, my voice steady, stripped of any hesitation or fear. Jonah looked up at me, the sharp, predatory intelligence returning fully to his eyes. "They have every structural advantage. They have the money, the legal authority, and the medical records. What do you have?" "I have the one thing they completely failed to account for," I replied, turning toward the heavy oak door. "I know exactly how they operate, and I am going to burn their entire empire to the ground." I could not simply march into the local police precinct and declare a billionaire was being poisoned by his own family. The authorities would demand hard physical proof, which I currently did not possess. Furthermore, one panicked phone call from me would give Grant and Lenora exactly the excuse they needed to execute their contingency plan. They would erase the digital security logs, flush the untraceable narcotics down the drain, and physically throw me off the estate before the police cruisers even reached the front gates. A direct confrontation would be professional suicide. I needed to build a trap so airtight they would not realize they were caught until the steel jaws snapped shut. My first strategic move required establishing a secure, external lifeline. I started with Jonah's old leather-bound address book, which I found buried beneath a stack of forgotten nautical charts in the bottom drawer of his wardrobe. Most of the business contacts were completely obsolete, but I found a direct office line for a woman named Tessa Calder. She was a ruthless, highly specialized litigator who dealt exclusively in high-net-worth elder abuse and complex financial exploitation. I used the landline in the dusty East Wing Conservatory at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, holding my breath with every ring echoing in my ear. When Tessa finally answered, I did not waste her time with pleasantries or emotional appeals. I gave her the raw data, the corporate shell games, and the name Marrow Peak Holdings. She grasped the severity of the corporate coup immediately. She agreed to operate quietly in the background, preparing the massive legal counteroffensive we would need when the time came. Next, I needed the digital proof of the medical tampering. I found Eli Sloan drinking black coffee in the staff kitchen just before dawn. I knew the man prided himself on the absolute integrity of his security system, and the recurring, unexplainable camera glitches deeply wounded his professional ego. The main server might be compromised, I told him, keeping my voice at a low, steady murmur while pretending to wipe down the countertops. Someone is manipulating the live video feed to cover their tracks. Do you keep offline, hard drive backups of the corridor cameras? Eli stared at me over the rim of his ceramic mug, his jaw tight. He was weighing his loyalty to his lucrative paycheck against his own rising, undeniable suspicions regarding Lenora's operations. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded. I asked him to pull the raw, unedited footage directly from the localized server racks in the basement, bypassing Lenora's administrative access entirely. He agreed to secretly deliver a secure flash drive to me by Friday evening. Acquiring the physical evidence required an accomplice inside the house. Marta Quinn was terrified of her employers. But her loyalty to the man who had employed her for 30 years finally outweighed her fear of Lenora's retaliation. During the chaotic shift change at 7 in the evening, Marta intercepted the discarded biohazard bags from the medical waste bins before the groundskeeper took them to the incinerator. In the dim, flickering light of the basement laundry room, we spread the empty foil blister packs and discarded plastic pill cups across the metal folding table. Hidden among the standard white chalky tablets, I found 3 distinctive capsules. They were deep purple, completely unmarked, and absolutely did not match the cardiovascular prescriptions listed on Jonah's official medical chart. I carefully sealed the rogue pills in a plastic evidence bag and hid them deep inside the lining of my winter coat. I brought the physical evidence to Jonah during one of his rare, clear mornings. He inspected the purple capsules resting in my palm, his face hardening into a mask of pure, carved granite. "They are accelerating the timeline," he noted grimly, his voice remarkably steady. Then, he outlined our one viable exit strategy. Hidden deep within the original corporate trust charter he had drafted 25 years ago was a highly specific contingency clause. It allowed him to demand an immediate, independent neurological evaluation to legally prove his competency, provided he signed the formal request during a documented state of total lucidity, with an impartial medical witness present. The execution of this plan was agonizingly complex. Jonah's periods of clarity were drastically shrinking. The chemical fog induced by the purple capsules was thick and heavy, often lingering until noon the following day. We had to perfectly time his signature, intercept the poisoned medication to give his brain time to clear, and bring the independent doctor onto the heavily guarded estate without triggering Lenora's sophisticated alarm bells. Tessa Calder provided the perfect solution. She arranged for Dr. Simon Varela, a highly respected independent neurologist, to visit Blackthorn House. To bypass Lenora's strict vetting process, we disguised his visit as a routine physical rehabilitation assessment. He was scheduled to arrive on Thursday afternoon, supposedly to evaluate Jonah's mobility and adjust his physical therapy regimen after a minor muscle strain. While the intricate pieces of the trap clicked into place behind the walls, I had to ensure Grant and Lenora remained completely blind to the impending threat. I had to transform myself into the exact, broken victim they fully expected me to be. I stopped washing my hair daily. I deliberately allowed dark, heavy circles to form under my eyes by staying awake reading legal statutes. I made my hands tremble slightly when I poured coffee in the staff kitchen. I lowered my gaze whenever Lenora entered the room, shrinking my physical presence to project total, crushing defeat. The ultimate test of my performance occurred on Wednesday afternoon. I was carrying a stack of folded linens down the main hallway when I saw Grant walking toward me, engrossed in a financial report on his tablet. I intentionally clipped the edge of the mahogany side table, sending the heavy white towels tumbling across the polished stone floor. I scrambled to my knees to pick them up, my shoulders hunched in an exaggerated display of frantic submission. Grant stopped walking. He looked down at me from his towering height, his expression morphing into a mask of supreme, victorious pity. "You look utterly exhausted, Aurora," Grant said smoothly, casually adjusting the cuffs of his expensive tailored shirt. "Perhaps this rigorous line of work is simply too demanding for someone of your fragile constitution. I warned you this environment requires a certain level of resilience." I did not snap back. I did not glare at him. I forced my eyes to well up with moisture and stared pathetically at the floorboards, my hands shaking as I clutched a folded towel to my chest. "I am just trying to survive the month," I whispered, my voice thick with manufactured despair and exhaustion. "I do not have anywhere else to go." Grant smiled. It was a cold, deeply satisfied curving of his lips that did not reach his eyes. He was entirely convinced I was broken. He believed I had completely surrendered to the inevitability of my financial and professional ruin. He stepped carefully over the spilled towels as if avoiding garbage on the sidewalk and continued down the hall, whistling a quiet, cheerful tune. He had absolutely no idea that my exhaustion was a meticulously constructed mask. He did not know about the independent neurologist scheduled to arrive the very next day. He did not know about the purple capsules hidden in my coat, or the encrypted offline security footage Eli was currently extracting, or the ruthless litigator building a massive legal warhead in the city. My trap was not designed for a petty screaming match in the foyer. I was not interested in temporary emotional satisfaction. My trap was designed specifically for the grand, formal legal stage where Grant and Lenora firmly believed they held all the power and all the cards. They were happily preparing to legally execute Jonah Vale and send me to prison, entirely unaware that the gallows they had so carefully constructed were actually meant for them. The pressure cooker finally exploded on a Tuesday afternoon. Lenora stood at the head of the grand dining table, her posture rigid, and officially declared an emergency summit to be held at Blackthorn House the very next morning. The guest list included the entire executive board of directors for Vale Meridian Logistics, the primary trust advisors, and a hand-picked panel of psychiatric experts. The objective was no longer a secret. They were going to officially execute the forced medical conservatorship and strip Jonah of his empire. Grant did not just wait for the meeting. He launched a devastating preemptive strike. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, he had circulated a heavily curated dossier to every single board member arriving the next day. The file was a masterclass in character assassination. It contained the ugliest details of our divorce settlement, my staggering credit card debt, and the vague, damning internal notes from my termination at Harborline Review Services. The implication was brilliantly vicious. The newly hired, financially desperate caregiver was emotionally unstable and highly motivated to manipulate the vulnerable billionaire for her own financial gain. To ensure I could not defend myself or contact Tessa Calder, Lenora implemented a sudden, draconian security protocol. Eli Sloan was forced, under direct orders, to confiscate my electronic keycard, completely revoking my access to the medical records room. Worse, my personal cellular phone was seized and locked in the security office. I was entirely cut off from the outside world, a ghost trapped inside a stone fortress, watching my executioners build the scaffold. The sheer weight of the impending trap was suffocating, but the true catastrophe struck just after midnight. I was in my bedroom, pacing the floorboards, when a muffled, agonizing groan bled through the solid oak door connecting my room to Jonah's suite. I did not hesitate. I shoved the door open and rushed to his bedside. Jonah was clutching his chest, his face completely drained of color, his skin slick with a cold, terrifying sweat. His breathing was shallow and erratic. The lethal combination of the unauthorized purple synthetic sedatives and the crushing psychological stress of the impending corporate coup had finally pushed his weakened cardiovascular system past its breaking point. He was having a mild heart attack. Panic seized my throat. I stood frozen for 3 agonizing seconds, staring at a horrifying choice. The entire house was asleep. The security cameras in the West Wing were conveniently disabled for the night. This was my absolute last, golden window of opportunity to slip downstairs, pry open the central administration desk, and steal the finalized merger documents linking Lenora directly to Marrow Peak Holdings. If I ran now, I could secure the final nail in their coffin, but if I left Jonah alone, he would die in this bed before dawn, and all the evidence in the world would not matter. I chose the man over the mission. I ran to the wall intercom and smashed the emergency button connecting directly to Eli's underground quarters. "Medical emergency in the master suite," I shouted into the speaker. "Do not call the local paramedics. Call Dr. Simon Varela immediately. Use the burner phone number I gave you." Eli arrived in less than 2 minutes, his tactical training overriding his usual stoicism. He helped me elevate Jonah's legs and administer a crushing dose of pure oxygen from the emergency medical cart. Dr. Simon Varela, who had been secretly stationed at a motel just 10 miles down the coastal highway in preparation for the morning meeting, arrived 20 minutes later, slipping through the heavy iron gates Eli had quietly left unlocked. The room was a whirlwind of hushed, frantic medical intervention. Simon administered a fast-acting sublingual nitrate and hooked Jonah up to a portable electrocardiogram monitor. as the jagged green lines stabilized on the small screen. Simon picked up the plastic cup resting on the nightstand. It contained the dissolved residue of the purple capsule the night nurse had forced upon Jonah hours earlier. Simon held the cup to his nose, his brow furrowing in deep, professional alarm. "This is not a cardiovascular beta blocker," he whispered, turning his sharp gaze toward me. "This is a heavy, off-market neuroleptic derivative. It is designed to induce severe chemical dissociation. Given his prior stroke history, administering this compound is not just medical malpractice. It is attempted murder." My choice to stay had miraculously handed us our most powerful weapon. We did not just have a neurologist ready to testify to Jonah's fundamental cognitive competence. We now had an unimpeachable medical expert who had directly witnessed and identified the chemical poisoning in real time. As the chaotic adrenaline slowly receded from the room, leaving behind a heavy, exhausted silence, I stepped out into the dark hallway to retrieve fresh linens. A shadow detached itself from the alcove near the staircase. It was Marta Quinn. The elderly housekeeper looked terrified, her hands trembling violently as she thrust a small, yellowed envelope into my hands. "I hid this 10 years ago," Marta breathed, her voice barely a whisper against the howling wind outside. "I found it tucked inside the false bottom of the breakfast table right after the missus passed away. I was too afraid to show Mr. Vale, and too terrified of Lenora to throw it away. You need it more than I do." She turned and fled back down the stairs before I could ask a single question. I retreated to the dim light of the bathroom and tore the envelope open. Inside was a handwritten letter from Jonah's late wife, Lenora's mother. The ink was faded, but the words were a devastating revelation. It was a desperate, fearful confession, detailing how Lenora had successfully forged her mother's signature on a series of irrevocable trust transfers years prior. The document proved a long, established historical pattern of deep financial fraud and signature manipulation. I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket, feeling the cold weight of the paper against my skin. Just as I stepped back into the hallway, Eli approached from the opposite end of the corridor. He looked exhausted, his uniform slightly rumpled, but his eyes burned with a fierce, quiet intensity. He pressed a small, encrypted black flash drive into my palm. "I had to manually dig through the partitioned backup servers in the basement," Eli muttered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "But I found the dropped data packets from the West Wing. I restored the missing video files from last month." "What is on it?" I asked, my fingers closing tightly around the drive. "Grant Mercer," Eli replied, his voice laced with pure disgust. The footage clearly shows him bypassing the security lock on the primary medication cabinet at exactly 1:17 in the morning. It was recorded on the exact same date Jonah had his most violent, heavily documented psychotic episode. "Your ex-husband is the one physically swapping the pills." I leaned against the cold stone wall, the sheer magnitude of the night washing over me. The storm outside was finally breaking, the fierce coastal winds dying down to a low, mournful hum. Through the tall glass windows at the end of the hall, the first pale, bruised light of dawn began to bleed across the horizon. I stood in the silent corridor, armed with a resurrected billionaire, a furious neurologist, a confession of historical forgery, and high-definition video proof of criminal tampering. I finally possessed every single jagged piece of the puzzle. I had the complete, undeniable truth resting right in the palm of my hand. But as the sun began to rise over Blackthorn House, illuminating the sprawling, isolated estate, I knew that having the truth was only half the battle. Grant and Lenora had spent over a year building an impenetrable fortress of lies, backed by millions of dollars and an army of corporate lawyers. They owned the narrative. They owned the board of directors. The evidence burning a hole in my pocket was absolutely useless if I tried to present it in a quiet room, or to a local police officer they could easily buy off. To destroy the monstrous machine they had built, I could not just whisper the truth. I had to detonate it. I had to walk directly into the center of their perfectly orchestrated legal theater, stand in front of the most powerful, the hardest people to sway they had invited, and force them to watch their entire empire burn to the ground. I walked back into Jonah's room. He was awake, his breathing steady, his eyes fixed sharply on the rising sun. I stood beside his bed, straightening my uniform, preparing for the war that was about to begin. The desperate, terrified woman who had arrived at this house was completely dead. I was ready. The grand library of Blackthorn House felt less like a meeting room and more like a courtroom designed for a swift, merciless execution. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy mahogany doors were sealed. Sitting around the massive antique table were the 7 executive board members of Vale Meridian Logistics, 2 senior trust advisors, and a heavily compensated psychiatric specialist Lenora had flown in from the city. I was instructed to stand in the far back corner of the room, positioned near the heavy velvet drapes like a piece of insignificant furniture. Lenora stood at the head of the table. She wore a severe, impeccably tailored black suit, projecting the image of a reluctant but deeply responsible daughter. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Lenora began, her voice a perfect blend of practiced sorrow and firm executive resolve. "We are here today to address a tragedy that can no longer be managed privately. My stepfather, Jonah Vale, has suffered a catastrophic, irreversible decline in his mental faculties. He has become violently erratic, entirely detached from reality, and poses a severe danger to himself and the staff. It is with a heavy heart that I must formally petition this board to support an immediate, involuntary medical conservatorship." The board members murmured in somber agreement. Then, Grant Mercer stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, casting a fleeting, dismissive glance in my direction. He was playing the role of the objective third-party risk consultant to absolute perfection. To compound the tragedy of Mr. Vale's declining health, we must also address a critical security vulnerability, Grant stated smoothly, leaning his knuckles against the polished wood of the table. Our internal audits have revealed severe irregularities regarding the patient's care. Specifically, we have reason to believe the current caregiver, Ms. Bennett, is profoundly unstable. She arrived at this estate carrying tens of thousands of dollars in personal debt and a documented history of professional misconduct. We suspect she has been manipulating the patient's confusion in a desperate attempt to extract financial favors. I stood perfectly still in the shadows. Grant and Lenora mistook my silence for the paralyzing terror of a trapped animal. They had no idea I was simply waiting for my cue. "Dr. Aris will now read his conclusive medical evaluation," Lenora announced, gesturing to her hired specialist. The doctor adjusted his glasses and opened a thick leather binder. Before he could utter a single syllable, the heavy library doors swung open with a violent crash that echoed off the high, vaulted ceiling. Tessa Calder strode into the room. She wore a sharp crimson trench coat and carried a massive leather briefcase. She bypassed the security guards entirely, marching straight to the center of the room. "This meeting is officially halted," Tessa declared, her voice cracking like a whip. "I represent Jonah Vale. I am serving formal legal notice of a sweeping injunction against this conservatorship proceeding. Backed by federal evidence of severe elder abuse, gross medical fraud, and a massive undisclosed financial conflict of interest." The room erupted into chaotic shouting. Lenora's face went absolutely pale. Grant took a step back, his polished veneer cracking for the very first time. "Who let you in here?" Lenora demanded, her voice losing its measured calm. "Security! Remove this woman immediately!" "Security works for the man who actually owns this house," I said. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly to the table. I did not look at Lenora. I locked eyes exclusively with Grant. The arrogant, victorious smirk he had worn since the day he handed me my divorce papers completely vanished. "Ms. Bennett is not an unstable caregiver," Tessa announced to the stunned board of directors. "She is a senior financial auditor who has spent the last month documenting a coordinated criminal conspiracy." I unbuttoned my pocket and tossed the clear plastic evidence bag onto the polished mahogany table. The 3 unmarked purple capsules rattled against the wood. "Those are heavy, off-market neuroleptic sedatives," I stated clearly, my voice ringing out in the silent room. They were never prescribed to Jonah Vale. They were secretly substituted into his nightly regimen to intentionally induce violent psychosis. Grant lunged forward, his face flushed with panic. This is absurd. She is a disgruntled, bankrupt ex-employee planting fake evidence. She was fired for embezzlement. I was framed, I shot back, taking a step closer to him. Just like you are framing him. But unlike you, Grant, I actually keep my receipts. I pulled the small, heavy cassette recorder from my pocket and slammed it onto the table. I pressed the play button. In the absolute, breathless silence of the library, the recorded audio hissed, and then Grant's own arrogant voice filled the room. We need someone so thoroughly desperate, so completely drowning in debt and ruined credibility, that if the old man turns up dead with the wrong pills in his system, absolutely no one will believe her over us. A collective gasp rippled through the board of directors. Lenora staggered backward, gripping the back of her chair as if she had been physically struck. A recording is easily manipulated, Grant stammered, his polished baritone shattering into a desperate, reedy pitch. This proves absolutely nothing. Then let us watch the video, I replied coldly. I handed Eli Sloane's encrypted flash drive to Tessa. She plugged it into the massive presentation screen at the end of the room. The high-definition footage flickered to life. It clearly showed Grant Mercer, standing in the West Wing corridor at exactly 1:17 in the morning, manually punching the override code into the primary medical lockbox and swapping the pill bottles. The timestamp on the video perfectly matched the date of Jonah's most violently documented breakdown. Furthermore, Tessa cut in, pulling a thick stack of legal filings from her briefcase, we have an independent evaluation conducted early this morning by Dr. Simon Varela, who is currently waiting in the hall. His findings are conclusive. Jonah Vale suffers from minor, manageable cognitive fluctuations due to a prior injury, but he possesses complete, undeniable legal competency. The violent mania you have all witnessed was entirely manufactured through chemical poisoning. Lenora finally found her voice, though it shook with frantic desperation. You cannot prove he is competent. He had a severe cardiac event just last night. He is incapacitated. The proxy vote defaults to me. The heavy wooden door connecting the library to the West Wing slowly creaked open. Jonah Vale walked into the room. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on a dark wooden cane, but his posture was straight, and his eyes were burning with a terrifying, absolute clarity. The fabricated tremor was completely gone. The fog had lifted. The king had returned to his courtroom. I am entirely capable of speaking for myself, Lenora, Jonah said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute silence. He walked to the head of the table, forcing Lenora to step aside. He looked at the stunned board members, then turned his piercing gaze toward his stepdaughter. 48 hours ago, during a period of complete, unmedicated lucidity, and in the presence of an independent legal witness, I activated the emergency continuity clause within the founding charter, Jonah announced. I have irrevocably transferred my controlling voting shares into a blind, independent trust. Your hostile corporate takeover is completely dead. The final fatal blow came from Tessa. She threw the last file onto the table, directly in front of the lead trust advisor. Lenora Vale orchestrated this medical coup to facilitate a massive corporate merger with a shell company called Marrow Peak Holdings, Tessa explained, her words sharp and clinical. And we have the routing numbers proving that Grant Mercer is the primary architect of that financial structure. He deliberately engineered Ms. Bennett's financial ruin during their divorce, funneling her assets into subsidiaries owned by Marrow Peak Holdings, specifically to weaponize her desperation for this exact scheme. The entire room flipped on its axis. The board members scrambled away from Lenora and Grant as if they had suddenly caught fire. The lead trust advisor immediately pulled out his phone and dialed the authorities, but we were already 10 steps ahead of them. Tessa gave a sharp nod toward the foyer. The library doors opened one final time. 2 agents from the Federal Financial Crimes Investigators, accompanied by an investigator from the State Elder Abuse Task Force, walked into the room. We had kept them waiting in unmarked cars at the front gate since 8 o'clock this morning. Grant tried to run. He bolted toward the side door, his face a mask of pure, cowardly panic. But Eli Sloan stepped solidly into his path, crossing his massive arms. "I would not recommend that," Eli growled. As the federal agents read Lenora and Grant their rights, placing them in handcuffs right next to the antique mahogany table, Grant locked eyes with me one last time. There was no arrogance left. There was only a hollow, terrifying realization that the woman he had meticulously broken had just buried him alive. I did not smile. I simply turned my back on him. Several weeks later, the storm had completely cleared. The arrests of Lenora Vale and Grant Mercer made national headlines. The investigations into Marrow Peak Holdings unraveled a massive web of corporate fraud, ensuring my ex-husband would spend decades in a federal penitentiary. I sat with Jonah on the terrace of Blackthorn House, drinking hot coffee and watching the winter sun glitter across the Atlantic Ocean. He looked older, tired, but deeply at peace. He did not offer me half his shipping empire like a character in a fairy tale. That is not how the real world works. Instead, he used his massive wealth and remaining influence to fund a relentless, scorched-earth legal campaign against Harborline Review Services. They were forced to publicly retract the false allegations, clear my professional record, and pay a massive settlement that wiped out every single cent of my fabricated debt. "I am stepping down from the logistics board," Jonah said quietly, setting his ceramic mug on the iron table. "I am launching a new philanthropic foundation. Its sole purpose will be to investigate and legally dismantle operations that use medical and financial manipulation to exploit the elderly. I need an executive director, someone who knows exactly how to read the hidden ledgers, someone who knows what it feels like to be hunted." He looked at me, offering a contract that would guarantee my financial independence for the rest of my life. I accepted the position. I did not take it for the money, or the prestige, or the power. I took it because, for the first time since my life had fallen apart, I realized I was no longer a victim waiting for the next blow. I had survived the absolute worst they could throw at me. I had walked into the dark, pulled the masks off the monsters, and burned their house to the ground, and I was just getting started. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. Please leave a comment down below and let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by clicking the hype button so that this story can be heard by many more people.